In 2020, I had been writing a book on restoring quality healthcare and reforming the U.S. healthcare system. And then the news started hitting about the infection. It became obvious after about a minute, anybody who understood medical science and fundamental biology, that the data was distorted. It was grossly exaggerating the infection fatality risk. And it was obvious that Fauci was not talking about the real data. And frankly, it was more than that. People were dying. The policies were really killing people. And they were not protecting high-risk people. I mean, it was totally just very, very poorly done.
Welcome to the Alix Mayer Show. Today's guest is Dr. Scott Atlas. He wrote a book in 2021 called A Plague Upon Our House about his fight in the Trump White House. And he famously was on the coronavirus task force in the White House for 3 months in 2020. And he came to call the trio of Deborah Birx, Robert Redfield, and Anthony Fauci the troika because they always made decisions together. Well, those people have all been in the news lately. So I wanted Dr. Scott Atlas's commentary on Fauci, on Birx, and on Robert Redfield. And boy, did Scott Atlas bring the goods. You're going to want to hear what he says about his time in the White House and about all these current events around Fauci especially. So tune in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and please share this episode with anyone you think would benefit from this information. We know so many of our listeners understand the relationship between health freedom and our personal and economic freedoms. It's the same principle. If you're one of our audience who's concerned about inflation, paper asset crises, and ongoing monetary crises, you may have already started accumulating gold and silver or are considering doing so. There's no gold dealer we know who's better positioned to serve the freedom community than Mish International in Menlo Park, California. I'm one of the many happy customers who's purchased gold or silver in their showroom, or I've had it delivered through their secure courier service. They are true veterans who are honest, fair, and reliable, and so knowledgeable regarding all the choices of gold and silver bars and coins to help you choose the products that fit your goals and your worldview. The principal, Robert Mish, is world-renowned for his expertise in rare coins as well. Write down this number, 650-324-9110. That's 650-324-9110. And visit mishinternational.com. That's MISH international.com to learn more about this notable company. Scott Atlas, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Alix Mayer Show today.
Happy to be here.
Well, to me, you're the man of the hour because there's been a lot of news dropping lately about COVID, and I've just been dying to talk to you to get your commentary on a lot of stuff, especially the Fauci testimony. I want to back up a little bit and talk about how you first got selected by Trump to be on the coronavirus task force in the White House. What were you doing at the time, and how did he come to select you for that?
In a funny way, it's indelible in my memory, of course, every detail. But as you would imagine, in 2020, at the beginning of the year, I had been writing a book on restoring quality healthcare and reforming the U.S. healthcare system because I had been in health policy full-time since 2012. And I was working on the book, and then the news started hitting about the infection and the Japanese cruise ship data early in 2020. And then it became obvious after about a minute, anybody who understood medical science and fundamental biology, that the data was distorted. It was grossly exaggerating the infection fatality risk. So, but I was hearing all this panic, and then they were starting to talk about lockdowns. And I was trying to explain this to my own children, who are smarter than I am, but they're non-medical, and they didn't understand what I was talking about. And so I thought, okay, this is really a problem if smart people don't understand what's going on. And so I dropped everything and I started to do research on the pandemic. This is a long-winded answer to your question, but I was doing research and publishing the data, and it was met with it was opposite to what they were doing. People like Birx and Fauci were already working in the White House and Trump administration. And I was saying, well, by March of 2020, I started to write saying, okay, there's several things going on here. Number one, we know from 15 years ago that pandemics of viral respiratory infections are not stopped by these lockdowns. Number one, that was known. And number two, the lockdowns were extremely harmful to healthy people. Closing schools, harmful. Isolating people, harmful. For a variety of reasons, but this was all known. And so it was also known that the infection had already spread far greater than people were acknowledging. And the third part that was known from the Japanese cruise ship early on was that there was a significant difference in the risk of serious illness or death depending on your age. And even on that initial data, which you could have examined because it was posted by Japan, low risk was incurred by younger people and very, very high risk by very, very old people. But there was a huge difference. So I started to write this, and it got a lot of national attention in March. At the same time, roughly, that John Ioannidis, another Stanford professor who was an epidemiologist, was saying similar things. And so I got a lot of press from this in March. I was writing it in March and April and May, and it was obvious that Fauci was not talking about the real data. It was going against fundamental biology. Like, for example, when you get an infection, you have significant protection immunologically from serious illness. And there was a lot of panic. And this is very bad because in panic, people behave irrationally, as you know. And it got some press, and I was writing piece after piece talking about how the data was showing already back in spring that the lockdowns were actually killing people and destroying lives more so than the virus. That was statistically known by then, and I was writing this. And so April, May, June, July, I was writing all this and getting more and more attention, doing some TV interviews. And then I got a call, to answer your question, in July of 2020 from the White House asking if I would simply come in and speak with President Trump, which, of course, people were dying. It's my country. Of course, the answer is yes. I mean, that's not even an appropriate question. So I went in and spent the day there, and a lot of people there were asking me questions, and Kayleigh McEnany was the president's press secretary at the time, and she brought me into her office and was showing all of these quotations from what I had said during my interviews and written in my papers, because she was following the data, and she's pretty sharp and knew the facts. And so at the end of that day, they asked me if I would come in and advise the president on the pandemic. And of course, I said, yes. This is at the end of July. But I said, I just want you to know what you're going to get, because I'm not going to just change what I think because somebody tells me to, even if it's the president. I'm going to say the facts. I'm going to show the data. And they said that Jared Kushner specifically, to his credit, said that's exactly why we want you. And so then I was asked to come in, and I started July 31st, August 1st, as an advisor to the president. And they told me, we want you to sit in and be part of the task force. And that I'll just finish with this. I said, but that they're not going to want to hear what I have to say because they were already there for 5 or 6 months. They didn't know what they were talking about. Frankly, they were bureaucrats for decades. They were not really actively critical thinkers and looking at the studies. And they said, no, it's important. We think you'll be able to convince them. So I said, okay. So I went in.
Got it. Okay. So this troika that you talk about, which is Birx, Redfield, and Fauci, Trump was already feeling like they were running the show and he needed you to come in and help push back on them. And so you joined thinking that because Trump wanted you there, your opinion and expertise would probably count more than it ultimately did, right?
Well, that's true. One of the things I recommended, because you may remember, but the president's press conference about the pandemic had been discontinued at that point, because he sort of said, well, the governors are really in charge, which is true because the federal policy does not really dictate what the states do. So he discontinued that. And I said, well, my advice was, first of all, resume press conferences. with the president saying the data, because I think people were panicking in part because, of course, of the media and everything, but also, and Fauci and Birx and Redfield saying nonsense, but also they thought he didn't even know what was going on, the president, which was not true. And I thought, okay, one thing to do, even if you don't know what to do about the pandemic, was to show this is the data, we are following this, and specifically, explicitly discuss it in the press briefings. And so they said yes, and I think that was a very good move. But you're right. Redfield, Birx, and Fauci, the reason I called them the troika in my book was because, first of all, they never contradicted each other in the task force meetings. They were there. And that's impossible if you're having a true scientific discussion about facts, because, everybody has an interpretation of things. But that was just showing they were there to cover each other, to provide this unanimous front. They were threatened by me because, remember, they had been going on for 5 months or so as the only medically credentialed people in the task force, really. And so, we're all taught to respect, and even to some extent, people are intimidated by people with these kinds of degrees, MDs and PhDs, and they don't feel like they are able, generally, people are not able to really question it, unfortunately. And, but I came in and, I'm used to being challenged. I was coming from almost 12 years of being head of a department in Stanford Medical School. And then I was working at Hoover Institution full time by then for about 8 years, where there's a lot of smart people. You have to know what you're talking about. People are going to challenge you. You don't just come in and pretend like you're some sort of expert that can't be challenged. So I was used to that. And frankly, it was more than that. People were dying. The policies were really killing people, and they were not protecting high-risk people. I mean, it just very, very poorly done. And so I went in, and their response, I came in with dozens of papers. I came in after discussing things with all the epidemiology people that I could find. I was up, till early morning every night going through the data. And I had some people who volunteered to give me data. When I asked them, give me this, they would generate it, give me this, because I didn't have any staff there. And so I would come into the meetings and I would be asked by, say, Vice President Pence, what do you think about the risk to children? And I would go through the data, and I would go through the papers up to date. And then he would turn to Fauci, and this happened. This is not just a hypothetical. And he would say, well, what do you think, Tony? And Fauci had no response, none.
Zero.
What do you think, Deb? He would call Deborah Birx Deb. And she would just get flustered and start sort of screaming at me saying, you're an outlier. You're an outlier. That's not a scientific response, number one. That's a response of a threatened person, a bureaucrat. And they really literally, this is something very important I want to say. They never, Redfield, Birx, and Fauci, never, not one meeting that I was at, brought in a scientific paper. Not a single time.
Never.
None. And they were basically bureaucrats. All of them were in bureaucrat positions for many years. And, they had a united front. That their reaction to me was to delegitimize me because I disagreed with them, rather than refute what I said with numbers, with data. They didn't do that because they couldn't. And they were the type of people who had entourages. So that means they had a staff giving them like bottom line of a paper that they may have seen. But, the way science works, besides the debate process itself, when you read a scientific paper, and I've reviewed for journals for decades and reviewed NIH grants, et cetera. When you review a paper by yourself, even looking at it, even if it's published, the first thing you do is you look at the methods section, which is the way the study was done, the study design. And if it's flawed, you're done considering their conclusions. It doesn't matter what the conclusions are if the study was done incorrectly or poorly. And so they didn't understand this process. They were not, in my opinion, legitimate scientists. They were not critical thinkers. They were threatened. They were flustered when I would say something. And of course, everyone around the table in the task force room was uncomfortable because, it's not a good atmosphere, but that's too bad. People were dying. It had to be said.
Wow. So when she called you an outlier, did you push back and say, hey, that's an ad hominem attack? That's pretty much the lowest form of argument. I mean, could anything like that fly with her? Would that get through to her?
Well, I didn't say that. I just said, well, that's the data. I don't remember, exactly what my response was, because I was sort of stunned at that sort of response.
I bet.
And, what was worse was that at the end of that and then they, by the way, I want to finish about the children's risk. Vice President Pence turned to Redfield, who was sitting next to me, I think, and he said, what do you think, Bob? And this was, by the way, early August 2020. The data was in. I just want to make sure people understand. The data was in by end of spring 2020. All of the necessary data, the risk to children. And by the way, the CDC itself had published at this time a study showing 1 in 4 college-age students in the United States by June of 2020 were contemplating suicide from the isolation. Okay, this was CDC. Redfield was ahead of CDC. Okay, so Pence turns to Redfield. So what do you think? And he sits back, he pauses. I mean, I could remember this like it was yesterday. And he says, let's just say the jury's still out, which of course is a nonsensical, very odd, statement, one of many he made. Later, he subsequently made several under oath that were really inane to the Senate. But at the end of that meeting, they pretended almost like what I said, all the data I said was just not said. They went on. Vice President Pence, the meeting, it progressed as if that discussion never occurred.
Wow. It's surreal. I can't imagine being you and being in that situation. Do you look back, Dr. Atlas, and think that there was a way you could have handled it differently and had a bigger impact going into that? Or do you think that they were just this troika and they were going to be on message with each other all the time and there was just no way to break through that?
That's a good question. I think there's nothing I could have done. And there's several reasons for that. Number one, they were not removed from the task force. The task force was not disbanded. They continued. By the way, Birx herself wrote all of the federal guidance to the state governors. Birx was in charge of the medical side of the task force, not Fauci. Fauci was the most influential. He was on TV a lot. He was on podcasts. He was all over the media, as we know. But Birx was in charge of the policy distribution and wrote it herself and disseminated to all the local public health officials, to all the governors. And so even though I said what had to be corrected, I had no authority. I was an advisor. I advised some governors who asked for my advice. Governor Nome, Governor DeSantis of Florida, I was advising since spring of 2020. And in fact, I have a sort of a good anecdote about that. Governor DeSantis was talking to me frequently over the spring and summer 2020 before I went into the White House. And then in the White House in August, he was still talking to me. And he knew the data, and he knew Birx was completely wrong and didn't know what she was talking about. And he called me up and he said, listen, I want you to come down in August. This was in August when I was first there. And we're going to tour the state. And Governor DeSantis said, are going to come with me because I'm opening all the schools to in-person. And you're going to explain the data at the press conferences. And I said, that's great. And he said, by the way, I don't want Deborah Birx to come down to Florida anymore. And I said, well, I have no control over that. And so he called up Vice President Pence, who was the director of the task force, authority-wise, and he told him that. And so Birx was not going down to Florida anymore. And that was, it's because she was contaminating she was spouting out nonsense and was very destructive. And DeSantis knew the data. He would call me up and he would repeatedly, since spring of 2020, and he was saying, tell me if I'm right, and he would tell me the data. And he had gone through all of the data analysis, including international data. He knew everything. He is a critical thinker, I think, as we all know by now. And he couldn't, he's in charge of the state, and he said, no, I don't want Birx to come down here anymore. And so I came down there and we went through and he opened the schools. All public schools were open to in-person in Florida. And he also gave parents the option of having learning from home if they were afraid. So that's leadership.
That is.
What isn't leadership, if I may say, is to allow Birx and Fauci and Redfield to keep spouting their irrational, destructive, and failed policies over and over and over again while people were dying.
I couldn't agree more. Now, usually when I think somebody's making an irrational statement or does something irrational, I give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that there's something that I don't know. But in this case, I think there might have been a bigger agenda going on, and it probably wasn't a positive agenda. It was probably something nefarious. Can I just ask you outright if you think they were carrying out a premeditated agenda that they were told to do?
I have no reason to think so.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. And it's attractive to believe that there's some real reason other than the obvious. And I'm not claiming to know that there wasn't. But I know that there are obvious reasons. And number one, they're not very smart. They're not very good at what they were doing. This is something that people don't want to believe. These are people with big time credentials. That doesn't mean anything. In fact, the era of trusting people solely on their credentials is over. It doesn't mean that credentials and training don't mean anything. They do mean a lot, but that's necessary, but not sufficient. Okay, that's not sufficient. That doesn't tell the whole story about somebody. Listen, we've all worked with people who are not very good at their jobs, every walk of life. And doctors and scientists, there's no difference there. There's plenty of bad scientists, bad doctors. What's number two reason is these people were bureaucrats. Okay, science is science. That's not running a bureaucratic organization for 38 years or 30 plus years like Fauci did. Birx ran the big bureaucratic organization for decades in government. These are people who are bureaucrats in the true sense of the word. And part of being a bureaucrat, in my view, is you're not challenged because it's a very hierarchical position. You're there. People are working under you. I've seen it. I saw it in the White House. People don't, there's not a lot of truth tellers around.
Yeah.
Especially when it's against authority. Okay. I was raised a certain way to question authority, frankly. I'm not from an elitist background. I don't buy into elitist things and people. But that's part of this personality, but also people were dying. It's an emergency. It doesn't matter about that stuff doesn't matter. But here, these are people, Birx and Fauci and even Redfield to some extent, who were in bureaucratic positions. They're not challenged. Right. Okay. We see it all the time. So they're not really ready for being challenged. They're not pushed to be thinkers, to have the answers at their fingertips. I'm from an academic environment where I'm challenged. I'm from an environment where people are not shy to tell me, no, I disagree with you. Okay. And also, I raised my own children to be able to say that to me and to everybody else. Good. That's good. I mean, that's how you arrive at truth, by thinking through the alternatives. So these people were very insecure. That's the third part about being a bureaucrat. They're brittle. They because they're never questioned. I'm giving you my opinions here, but because they're not questioned, they are really frantic when people do question them. They're not used to this. No. And they're very insecure. People kiss up to them. Okay, this is my poor vocabulary at trying to say these are people that are very they're used to obsequious people. They're sheltered. They're in a cocooned position. Okay, that's not my personality. I don't do that to anybody, period. And that's a very harmful thing when you're not challenged and people are worried about what you think of them. And, this was very, very harmful. So there's a fourth thing, which I'm writing something on right now, if I can go on, and that is something that is called cognitive dissonance.
I love that concept. It explains a lot.
You know about this, and of course, everybody has heard about it, and they sort of simplify it as, well, people don't like to be wrong. So they buy into what they've always said. That's the essential bottom line of it. But there's more to it than that. And this, to me, is one of the main explanations for why people will never, literally never admit they were wrong about the lockdowns or the school closures or the isolation of people from their dying mother or father, or even the vaccine mandates and the vaccine recommendations for children who had no significant benefit, and all of it was really risk from side effects. They won't say they were wrong, because cognitive dissonance is really a biological mechanism. Okay, it is a psychological brain mechanism that really is going to stop you from being able to admit you're wrong. It's your brain is triggered, if I hate to use that word triggered, but your brain, reacts with, as if it's being threatened, rather than just, well, let me think about that again. It's a threat. It's processed biologically. This is known. This is from the literature. And so I think this is part of what they did too. They were trying to protect, vanity. Yes, they're insecure people. Now we see the Fauci diary, and there's he's never going to say he was wrong, because he's worried, I would guess, about liability for prosecution, criminal prosecution. So, there's a lot of things going on here, which we know. Yeah. But I do think part of it is cognitive dissonance. This is why your neighbors are, maybe you don't live where I live in Palo Alto, but they're never going to admit they're wrong. That's why the experts at Stanford, the so-called experts, I'm putting that in quotes, are never going to admit they're wrong. It's not just a conscious effort to protect their reputation. It is really, in my view, cognitive dissonance.
100%. So I want to ask you a couple questions about things you sparred over when you were on that task force. I know you sparred over school closures, and you gave that incredible statistic of 25% of college students considering suicide. And then what did they do that fall in 2020? They locked up students in dorms and hotels if they tested positive for COVID. I know you sparred over mass testing, which was actually illegal, because the emergency use authorization instructions said this is not to be used on somebody without symptoms, yet they were testing everybody. So I want to ask you a specific question. Did you ever spar over IgG testing showing that there was mass immunity already in the population?
I would put it a different way. I pointed out that the data on immune protection, and when we say protection, we're talking about not protection from getting a reinfection, but protecting from the significant consequences of the infection. Okay, that's the immune protection. I pointed out several times the basic biology. Anybody who's listening to this who has a child in high school AP biology, let alone college biology or medical school biology or PhD biology, anyone who knows anything about infections knows that there's two things going on. Number one, every viral respiratory infection, and there were, by the way, 4 coronaviruses already in circulation, you get immune protection after being infected. This is not like news. This goes back not just to smallpox, not just to people having smallpox parties so that they would become immune to smallpox because they would get the infection intentionally. But this goes back to, thousands of years ago, as my friend Martin Kulldorff used to laugh and tell me about. So, this is basic biology, that there is immune protection after getting infection. They didn't want to believe that. Secondly, when you test somebody for antibodies, which is what you're asking me specifically, antibodies come and go. Okay, antibodies come after infection, then they go away. that does not equate with protection going away. Everybody who is at all knowledgeable about biology, let alone somebody who's supposed to be an expert like Birx or Fauci, and Redfield, is supposed to know that you have long-term immune protection. You have immune protection in your, what are called T cells and B cells, which are in your bone marrow and in the other parts of your body that are there to protect you when you get a reinfection from any serious consequence of the infection. Yeah. And I pointed this out actually in a press conference at one of those press briefings with the president. It's one of my sort of, I hate to use the word favorite memories, but one of the reporters was very hostile, as they all were. Because Redfield went out and said that 90+% of people are still very vulnerable, meaning vulnerable to serious illness or death, which of course was grossly wrong in so many levels.
Yeah.
But he was just going by the antibody level that you're pointing out, and that's a transient thing. But he wasn't even. So I corrected him, and I started trying to say at this press conference that, there's long-term immune protection, different kinds of mechanisms in your own body. But, this is not something you tell people who have no idea what you're talking about in a 15-second answer in a national press conference. But, this is basic biology. So I did have these arguments with them, and they just really were dug in and just denying not just obvious common sense, but basic, fundamental, high school level biology.
Right. They had a very reductionist view of the antibodies providing protection when there's many other parts of the immune system. That makes total sense. Okay, I'm going to ask you one other question before I get into your commentary on current events, and that is about PCR testing. I was on a PCR testing coalition, and we were noticing a lot of studies supporting the fact that there were a lot of false positives for PCR testing, yet I think on the coronavirus task force, and certainly here in Santa Clara County with Sarah Cody, they were taking every PCR positive as a case. Did you have any problem with that?
100%. And I wrote about this in the book, but this is this is another interesting, shocking thing that they were totally misunderstanding or denying, basically, because it wasn't, again, I hate to say it, but these people, they were so low level. They could not, I've never worked with people that low level in my entire medical career. I've been at medical science universities for my whole career. Okay, I graduated from University of Chicago with an MD degree. I did my training at Northwestern University and then finished it at University of Pennsylvania. I was on faculty at University of Pennsylvania, Mount Sinai in New York, at Stanford so I've had 25 plus years of academic medicine. I have never worked with people that were that low level. And this is it's an emotional statement. It's not what you asked me, but you can't, it's shocking. And the PCR testing was one of these examples where you didn't have to be very knowledgeable. It's really first level investigation of what was going on. 97 roughly % of positive PCR tests, using it the way they were using it, the techniques they were using in the United States, were false positives.
97?
What do I mean by false? Yeah,
97%.
97% of people with a positive test were not infectious, not contagious. Why do I say that? Because they were setting the settings, to sort of simplify it, to the point where they were detecting dead fragments of virus.
Right.
You have to have live virus to be contagious, obviously.
Right. Fauci said that if you cycle more than 35 times, you get nothing but dead nucleotides, which means somebody's not infectious.
He actually said it in an interview. Fauci, that quote that you're reciting, that you're just detecting dead pieces of virus the way they were doing it, yet they didn't correct it. Yet they didn't make the case. And so why is that important? Not just for case numbers, although that is important because that was used to fan the flames of the fear. And policy, though, was generated from that because they also isolated people. And when I'm saying isolated, they were isolating people at the time for 10 days on the basis of a positive PCR test. Right. That includes young, healthy people. That includes the 1 in 4 college students who were contemplating suicide, that includes the teenage girls who had suicidal ideation, all the teenagers who had to go seek medical help for depression, for anxiety. That includes all the drug abuse. That includes shutting down businesses, requiring people to stay indoors, locking up outdoor playgrounds. I mean, this was all a complete, massive, erroneous implementation of science, so-called data, to generate completely wrong policy.
Most people knew the false positive rate was so high. What were they up to? Why did they need to scare us so much?
2 things. First, I'll say, I don't think it's true most people knew. Okay, there are people that knew. There are people that should have known. They either didn't know. I'm not sure Birx knew. Okay, Fauci knew because he said it. But there's a secondary gain from, I think this is what I infer from the parts of the Fauci diaries, but I knew it then because it was obvious. I was in their room, listening to the discussion. They loved being the authority. They loved being listened to, and they loved being loved by the media and the public. And so, I don't know. This is my impression. Okay, I can't prove that, but it's sort of obvious.
Well,
and
yeah.
so what do you gain by doing that? Well, I mean, listen, Fauci clearly was enamored with his stardom, if you read the diaries, and knowing all these famous people and being on TV and stuff. And so this is a group of people who all of a sudden were being listened to all over the world, were on stage, and were just really receiving massive adulation, which, by the way, went on for years after the failures, after the death, the destruction of their policies. And their policies were implemented, by the way. Yet there was this disconnect with the public. They said the policies were destructive, they were horrible, yet these people were given accolades, awards, financial prizes, honorary degrees, graduation speech invitations, and positions in major universities. This is sort of a Kafkaesque, absurd application of logic that defies any kind of description.
If we had 97% false positives, Dr. Scott Atlas, was there a pandemic?
I think we can say there was a pandemic. I'm not a believer that, first of all, I don't want to believe the worst case scenario that the whole thing was a lie anyway, but I don't think it was a lie. There were many lies told, though. There's no question about that. There were many lies, false beliefs. There's a cover-up seemingly going on about a lot of things. But I think it's no doubt that a lot of people died, and they died from COVID. And what I'm going to add to the qualifier to that, this is a statistic most people don't know, is that in the United States, 2/3 of deaths were in people with greater than or equal to 6 underlying illnesses. 2/3 of COVID deaths. So if you think about it this way, when you look up nursing home data, okay, nursing home by definition, generally speaking, is where very, very frail old people live. That's the typical nursing home, right? And these are people with significant underlying illnesses of a variety of types. When you have a common cold, there's data on this. When you have a common cold and you enter a nursing home, a lot of people die in the nursing home from a regular cold. It doesn't take anything hardly at all to spread and have massive death inside that environment. Okay, that's a closed environment with a lot of very, what are called frail elderly. And so this is one of the things that there's no question that these people die. If you look at the nursing home data, they died, a lot of them from COVID. Now, there's another side of this pandemic question, which is that there's a huge percentage of deaths that were called COVID deaths that were not from COVID. Okay, this is documented in published data, both by academic universities. For instance, Stanford University published the data on looking back at hospitalizations from COVID in young people in their pediatric hospital. And what they found, and there's another study also that replicated this, that the two studies, between 50 and 80% of so-called COVID hospitalizations were not hospitalizations from COVID. They were hospitalizations of people who had a positive COVID test, but they were hospitalized for literally something else, whether it was appendicitis or head trauma or something else. Okay, so that's one part of the answer to your question. The second part of the answer is the CDC published a study which has gone sort of by the wayside. In the CDC data, they reviewed charts on people who were called COVID deaths. And when you go back and look at the chart in detail, they said it is not feasible, their word was plausible, I think. It is not plausible that something like 20 to 35% of COVID deaths in that study were from COVID, because they didn't have any symptoms of COVID. Okay, they had a positive COVID test. And there were reasons why those people were called COVID deaths. One of the reasons was there was a financial incentive to hospitals, as we know, to categorize somebody as COVID because they got extra money to take care of people. So there were a lot of COVID so-called hospitalizations or COVID deaths that were not from COVID. But I don't want to say that there were not a lot of deaths from COVID, because there were. It's just that the actual numbers are exaggerated, and it's not necessarily even intentional. I'm not saying that, but it's factually untrue. And that's why when people who you and I both know get on TV and say the United States had the worst COVID response in the world, that's a false statement. And the reason is that a lot of the U.S. COVID deaths were not from COVID. They were miscategorized. The statistic is false. So, even people, quote, on our side, unquote, meaning people who we like or who we believe on a lot of things, and they're accurate. It's a misstatement to just assume that all the deaths from COVID that were categorized as deaths from COVID were actually COVID deaths, because they weren't.
That's right. Well, and I also don't like assuming that every hospital death was from COVID. A lot of it was from medical mismanagement, and the incentives that you mentioned, the incentive to ventilate, the incentive to give remdesivir, the incentive to put COVID as a cause of death. I mean, that all manipulated the death counts as well, right?
100% correct. What you just said. It's 100% correct. It's factually true. And it doesn't matter if people disagree with that statement. That doesn't change the truth.
Hey folks, I'm here with Del Bigtree on the set of The Highwire.
Hey, good to see you.
And Del, you're coming to Silicon Valley this fall, aren't you?
I am. I think a lot about it. The last fundraiser I did with you, we did like 2 different nights.
I had 5 couples come up to me and say that you saved their marriage.
Oh, good.
I had a PA and a nurse say that you had totally changed their minds, and that creates waves.
Yeah, it really does. If you want to get to a great fundraiser, is doing great work. Free Now Foundation, I love the work that you guys are doing. California can get really testy. You're the most oppressed state in America, but you're actually starting to make some headway. We're seeing some of the original authors of SB 277 wondering if they've made the right decision.
And I have to say, California is the worst state in the country for medical freedom. There's a medical exemption on the books, but it doesn't function. It's designed to fail. So we have no options for children to go to school in California without vaccines. But there is so much hope. Free Now Foundation, we have 2 lawsuits. One of them would totally end the need for exemptions. There's a lot of stuff happening in California, and I think we're going to see a lot of progress over the next year or 2, and things are going to change dramatically.
Well, look, you want to get involved, and I'm going to be speaking at this fundraiser September 12th in Silicon Valley. Free Now Foundation, where do we go to sign up or be a part of that?
Go to freenowfoundation.org and you can sign up for the fundraiser. You can get to meet Del in person, get a picture with him, ask your questions. We always have a robust Q&A. It is going to be a good time. Margaritas, organic tacos, and all of your medical freedom friends.
Absolutely. I'll see you there.
Me too.
Do you ever wonder what my foundation, Free Now Foundation, really does? It turns out that after all the articles and videos that I do, that a lot of people still wonder what we really do. We're California's leading medical freedom nonprofit, but did you know we're the only group in California trying to end the medical mandates so children can go to school safely in California? And what does that mean? People don't get this, but it means There's no need for an exemption if there's no mandate. We won't need a religious exemption. We won't need a medical exemption. We won't need any type of exemptions anymore because parents will just be able to say no. No is a complete sentence. And Free Now Foundation is going to stay in the courts and do this legal strategy, pursue it as long as it takes until parents call the shots again in California and beyond, and parents can just say a simple no. So if you share this vision of a world where we don't have medical mandates, where children do not need an exemption of any sort to go to school, and this work calls to you, please consider supporting us at Free Now Foundation, freenowfoundation.org. That's spelled FREENOW foundation.org, and make a donation today. Okay, so I know we're running out of time, so I want to get your opinion on some current events that are pretty exciting here.
Sure.
So given that Fauci and the troika were power tripping, were you surprised at all by Fauci's diaries and his testimony?
No, nothing in the diary that I have seen surprised me, except minor things like when he admitted in writing that I was right, that the school closures were inappropriate. He said the schools were not a center of spread. Okay, he never admitted that to me, but he said it in October in one of the emails that I saw. But, nothing in terms of the behavior surprised me because I saw it. I saw when I was walking through the White House in the morning or in the afternoon, there was on the White House lawn a bunch of reporters. Okay, and I didn't like talking to the reporters. I had to, and one of the things that I think I did accomplish was saying the truth to people, and that's important to do the interviews for that reason. But I wasn't interested in being on stage. In fact, I didn't think I would be until President Trump said, "Let's go out there together," and I said, "Okay." But Fauci, I had heard, for instance, before I got there, he was on the White House lawn handing out his cards, soliciting interviews. So this idea that he was thrilled to be in front of the camera or on stage. He was doing more than one interview per day when I was there. And so when I heard him complain or people complain that somehow the Trump administration was trying to block his interviewing, that was absolutely untrue. That's ridiculous. He couldn't be on TV or in podcasts or on media more than Anthony Fauci. But so the vanity and stuff, that none of that surprised me. I saw it, but it really isn't the important part of this, as you know. The important part of this is to make sure people understood that, A, he and Birx presided over the most lethal, most deadly, and in my opinion, most unethical public health response in modern history, because they got their policies that they recommended implemented. They were implemented. They own the results. But also, I think this kind of malfeasance that I sort of knew about with their media sort of intimacy. Let's put it that way. Manipulating, using the media as a platform, being friends with the media. It's inappropriate. Okay. I heard Birx once say, "Oh, I have a meeting with Sanjay later today." Okay. I didn't know any reporters by their first name. It's not the problem that she had the interview with CNN or Sanjay Gupta, but the problem is, she felt totally natural being friendly like that, or like Fauci was with Jake Tapper and some of these things, these revelations. But the bottom line is, no, I wasn't surprised. The only thing that did surprise me is what you're probably going to ask me, which was the idea of blocking or deleting or being involved with suppression of information about the origin of the virus.
Oh, are you talking about blocking FOIA requests?
No, I'm talking about this idea of sort of, it seems like there was a group effort to commandeer scientists to write the paper that said that there was no lab origin possibility, or to, stop talking maybe about the possibility of that. We didn't talk about that. This is maybe something that is of interest. At the task force meetings, and I was only there for August, September, October, and then I left in November of 2020. But the meetings I was at, the origin of the virus was never discussed. Never. I mean, the lab leak versus a Wuhan, a market leak or contagion directly from bats to humans or whatever. This was not part of the meetings that I was in. Now, I was not invited to meetings with CIA. I was not in a lot of meetings that Redfield or Fauci may have had, but I was not ever hearing that kind of discussion.
David Morans just pled guilty to defrauding the government and using his personal email to hide data, denying FOIA requests, working with Peter Daszak on gain of function. Did you ever have an inkling that there was fraud going on, or did you just see stupidity?
I didn't think that there was anything like covering up information about things they knew consciously, including that sort of side of things. The gain of function topic, by the way, it was never discussed in my presence at the meetings I was at. But when you look at the history of things, and you see in the scientific literature, there are papers written by U.S. scientists in concert with Wuhan Institute of Virology scientists. And in those papers, they list funding from NIH grants on gain of function research in coronaviruses that were funded under the umbrella of Anthony Fauci, because it was an infectious disease NIAID, National NIAID, National Institute of Infectious Disease, basically. And so he's in charge of that. That was in 2014. And you remember the gain of function topic. This is a big deal in terms of the Rand Paul investigation. The gain of function funding was denied under oath by Anthony Fauci. And so that's a potential problem. The second problem is that under the Obama administration, they had blocked gain of function research temporarily during that part of that time period. Yet the funding continued, and it was shared. The research that it funded was done in concert with Wuhan Institute of Virology in the 2014 to 2019 timeframe. Okay, there's actually several grants, more than 3, that funded gain of function research that was used to do research in collaboration in Wuhan. And so this is NIH money. Not only was it, I think, banned under the Obama administration during part of that time, but secondly, of course, that's dangerous, even if it wasn't banned, to do dangerous research at arm's length in China, where I've been a visiting professor in China. They don't have the same standards in terms of their labs. I visited labs and hospitals at the top levels in Shanghai and Beijing before COVID, just as a medical scientist visiting professor. They don't have the same standards. It's not like looking at UCSF or Stanford or, Mass General laboratories. It's sloppy. It's a very high risk to do dangerous research without direct supervision. Secondly, this is U.S. taxpayer money.
Right.
Okay. This is your money. Right. The government has no money. The NIH has no money. The money comes from taxpayers. They're taking your money and funding research that is being done, not just dangerous, but seems to be during the time period where it was forbidden under the Obama administration. That's a problem for the people who signed off on that research.
So you think there should be a moratorium on gain of function research, right?
Well, I think it's a complicated question. I know, my friend Jay Bhattacharya has issued this. I think that there's a couple problems with a broad ban. Okay, and it's something, it has to be thought about. I'm not necessarily defending gain of function research, but what I'm saying is let's think clearly here. Let's not do knee-jerk stuff. First of all, gain of function research is a broad term that can be applied to many different types of research that are not that dangerous. And so if you're going to start banning stuff on the basis of what it's called, you got to be careful what you're banning. This is just common sense. I think everybody would agree with that. The second point is that dangerous research is not nearly as dangerous if we're doing it in a very select, very monitored situation in labs that we have trustworthy, and I'm not sure there are many, but in labs where we have trustworthy oversight, that certainly excludes funding that kind of research elsewhere. there is a difference between just broadly blocking all of it and being smart about where you're doing it. If you look at the details of what Jay wrote in the NIH directive, they're not going to block it. Okay, it's not really true. You have to look at the details, and they're doing something more on the lines of what I'm saying. The third part that I want to bring up is that when you're doing a block on research that is potentially important, it's very naive to think that our adversaries are not going to do the dangerous research. Okay, you think that China is not going to do the research if they're, let's just say in a hypothetical, they're developing biological weapons with gain of function research, or North Korea or Iran. And there's very smart scientists in these countries. You think they're going to just say, hey, we're going to also, we're not going to do it. We're scared of it. No, I doubt that. I think it's very naive. And we need to make sure we're on top of defense research against this sort of thing. So that's why I'm cautious about gain of function research. Okay. But I'm also cautious about just unilaterally saying we're not doing it here and thinking that somehow has no consequences. I think we got to be very careful about what we're doing. I understand the reaction, but I think if you think like a realistic person, number one, and also like a scientist, which I think Jay Bhattacharya's directive is a lot more nuanced than what's being released to the public, because the document's there. You have to read it. It has to be done under supervision, it has to be done under strict supervision, under strict guidance, and in very select places so that we can make sure we have a handle on it. But I'm not so sure it's smart to just somehow just say, oh, we're done doing that, because it's being done elsewhere and people want to harm our country.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like that response. It's a very measured and rational response to my question about gain of function. I know we need to close out. I have a question about Robert Redfield and Deborah Birx. First, I want to say that Deborah Birx in fall of 2023 was moved to Lubbock, Texas. And I want to find out from you if you think that was a demotion or what she was doing there, because there was that measles outbreak shortly after she moved there. And then second, I want to ask you also about Robert Redfield, because he's come around to a more moderated approach that he would have taken to COVID. And it sounds more like what you were saying in 2020. Can you comment on both of those things?
Briefly on Birx, I don't follow her career. It's not worth following, frankly. She was given a position in public policy in Texas. I think it's called the George W. Bush Institute. I don't remember what it's called, Bush Policy, which I think is a disgrace. It's very sad. This is a person who was a grossly inept failure during the pandemic policy that she ran. And I think that's just a disgrace. I don't know what her current position is, or if she works at all in the government. I think it's sad that there's any credibility retained by her. And it's a sad statement about our society. It's a sad statement about government if they still believe in her. So let's move on to Redfield. Redfield, I have seen his statements, and I want to believe that he really thinks what he's saying now, but I think there's also something else going on. And that is that Fauci is the whipping boy right now. Okay. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve it. I'm not making a comment on that. All I'm saying is that he is not only being blamed for a lot of things, but he is turned into a scapegoat for other people who are anxious to deflect blame to him. Mm-hmm. Robert Redfield was the head of the CDC. During 2020, Robert Redfield's CDC put out directives to close schools. Robert Redfield signed on to that. Under his direction, Robert Redfield made statements to Congress, quote, "These masks will stop will end the pandemic in 8 weeks," unquote. Okay, this is completely buffoonish.
It's laughable.
He said a lot of things. He didn't know what he was talking about masks in the task force meeting. I have some of these recollections written in my book, Plague Upon Our House. But without going into detail too much, I think it's very convenient for people who were grossly wrong to start criticizing Fauci now as if they weren't complicit and, in fact, equally as bad. You know, if you think about it, the head of the CDC had a more authoritative position than Anthony Fauci, at least technically speaking. Now, Fauci was the most influential, but that's because he was sought out by the media and he willingly went on and sought it out himself, maybe. But Redfield was in charge of the CDC. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so that's not great. He also said that these masks, he held up a mask, is that these masks are highly effective in blocking the transmission of the virus when they weren't. And that was ludicrous. And why is that bad? It's not just dumb. Okay, it's worse than that. It's very dangerous because he was saying that to people who had high risk from COVID. I mentioned to you, people that are sickly and elderly, they died from COVID. That, like, they could have died from a lot of things. And instead that gave them this somehow, I believe, it gave them a false sense of security. Okay, when you have all kinds of immunocompromise, or if you're got 6 or 8 comorbidities and you're a 90-year-old in a nursing home, if you think you put a mask on and therefore this virus doesn't go around the mask, through the mask, all kinds of things, it was grossly wrong. And I think that was very dangerous. And if I had to guess, my guess would be that advice killed people. That's my guess. I can't prove it. I'm not accusing him of killing people. But I think there's a case to be made.
I agree with you. Well, Dr. Scott Atlas, what a pleasure to get to talk to you today. Are there any words of wisdom that you want to leave our viewers with?
I would like to say one thing that I answer when people say, what are we going to do now that trust is destroyed? Because the real legacy of Fauci and Birx and Redfield is a total loss of trust in public health, in medical science. And that's bad because I actually do not want the pendulum to swing to there is no such thing as legitimate medical science. We should just pretend that anybody who says anything is just as legitimate, that all kinds of pseudoscience about things like wellness, but about everything should be just immediately taken as valid. No. But what can we do as individuals? Because we cannot expect regular people to look into the detail. Okay, nobody has time, nobody has training. And that's unrealistic. But what I do think you should do, the doctors that are out there, okay, your healthcare is your healthcare. You don't have to listen to anybody, of course. It's a free society. But you also should be able to just say, not be intimidated by your doctor. You go in, the doctor tells you to do something or thinks this is advisable or gives you advice. You should ask, what's the data on that? Why? Why are you telling me that? It doesn't mean that you know the data, but they have to know the data. And if they don't know the data, you need another doctor, number one. Or if they get angry that you're somehow challenging them, because a lot of doctors in the position of authority are very comfortable with that authority. I'm a doctor, so I feel I can understand and criticize that. You know, I tell my wife this all the time, and she did this when she went in. They were telling her to take these COVID boosters and all this, and my wife, who happens to be a smart, critical thinker, said, well, she has a different last name than I do, so they didn't know who she was at Stanford. And she would say, well, what's the data on that? And they would get angry that they were being challenged, and that's just not okay. So as a patient, your job is to be a critical thinker for yourself. The trust is gone, and that's fine, but you should have a healthy degree of skepticism. It doesn't mean you should distrust. That's different. But you should at least have some skepticism. Your doctor should be able to answer the challenging questions that you have, and you can't be afraid to ask them.
That's great advice. I totally agree with that. Having been a patient for 30 years after my own vaccine injury, I think that's excellent advice. Dr. Scott Atlas, thank you again for coming on the Alix Mayer Show. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for making the time, and I think people are going to get a lot out of this interview.
Thanks, Alex. Great seeing you.
We are so happy to have as our prime sponsor, Mish International, Northern California's acclaimed specialists in rare coins and gold and silver investments. Our friend and supporter Robert Misch is the same principal that started the company back in 1963, and he's still there every day with 63 years of experience. He has integrity, reliability, and fair pricing, whether you're buying or selling. When you have business to do with precious metals, you'll always be treated well at Misch International. Call 650-324-9110 and tell Robert that Alex sent you.